Good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started now since everyone's more situated here. I wanted to take the time to thank you for joining us in person and also joining us online at our Northern California State and Local Transportation Needs Assessment Policy Recommendation Workshop today. My name is Francis Diaz Sanchez. I am the project manager for the needs assessment effort. And Justin, if you could go to the next slide. And I wanted to turn it over to our Chief Deputy Director, Paul Golozewski, to provide a welcome and opening remarks today. Paul?
Thanks, Francis. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us today. So we at the California Transportation Commission are developing the full report for the state and local transportation needs assessment required under Senate Bill 1121. And we appreciate you taking the time to participate in this workshop. Today's workshop kicks off the policy recommendations discussion for the report and provides an opportunity to develop and discuss the assessment's first principles, which will help define the what and the why we need to invest in our transportation infrastructure. We'll also discuss some potential policy scenarios that would help address the ongoing decline in the state's excise gas tax revenues. And this is really important so that we can identify a sustainable and equitable funding mechanism, as well as other policy solutions to address our state's transportation needs. We did have a workshop that was essentially the same as this one on May 30th in Southern California. So for those of you who attended that workshop on May 30th, this one is essentially the same thing. Of course, you're welcome to attend today again too. We did hear some suggestions on the first principles and funding scenarios at that workshop. And just to highlight a few of them, we heard about aging and disabled populations and accessibility needs. We heard about the importance of maintaining the existing transportation system. We heard about the importance of sustainable, stable, and equitable funding, the significance of regional and local partnerships, community engagement and needs, and the importance of security and privacy for system users. So with that, we really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. Developing this assessment can only be done successfully by us at the Commission working directly with all of you, our regional and local partners, as well as other stakeholders. Your partnership ensures that we're accurately capturing revenue projections as well as our multimodal transportation needs. It's really critical that the needs assessment convey how the transition to zero emissions vehicles will be impacting our fuel tax revenues and how this affects our ability to deliver accessible, resilient, transit active transportation and roadway projects that support our state goals for safety, equity, climate, and economy. And with that, I will turn it back to Francis.
Thank you, Paul. Justin, could you go to the next slide, please? Oh, next slide. So this is just a brief, overview of what we're doing today. And so I'm going to hand it over to Justin next to talk about the webinar logistics, and then we'll go through our presentation, just providing a status of what we've been working on since the interim report was released, the information we've been gathering, and then dive into our first breakout or focus discussion around the development of our first principles for the policy recommendations, have a quick break, and then come back for our second discussion on, I realized breakout session should say first principles, and then yes, just policy recommendations on the possible scenarios of what to do with the declining gas tax. So then we'll have a high level overview of the needs assessment delivery schedule for the rest of the year, and circle back on our next steps. So it's pretty straightforward. I'm going to turn it over to Justin now to provide the webinar logistics. The only thing that we request is to, if you're online, please, please, please do type in the questions that you have in our Q&A because it helps us keep track of what's being asked. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. Hello, and welcome to the Senate Bill 1121 Technical Workshop. The CTC exists to make transportation planning, funding, and policy more understandable and accountable. Our workshops can take place in person or virtually to allow staff to hear directly from our stakeholders around California, and so you can participate more fully no matter where you are. The workshop agenda is located on our website at www.catc.ca.gov. Live closed captioning is available on this webinar. Please select the Show Captions tab at the bottom of your screen. There are a number of language options available there to choose from. Any document the CTC creates can be translated into any language you need. Simply email us at ctc@catc.ca.gov, and we will have them returned to you as quickly as possible. For all our workshops, we encourage interaction with our stakeholders. There will be opportunity for questions and comments at the end of the workshop or throughout it if needed. For those attending via Zoom, you should see the webinar control panel likely located on the bottom of your screen. There you'll find the raise hand and Q&A tabs. We encourage you to use the raise hand feature as soon as we reach the public comment item to give the system time to acknowledge you. Commission staff will let you know when it's your turn to make your comment. Alternately, you may use the Q&A tab to submit your comment or question. And as preferred by Francis, please provide written questions in the Q&A tab so we can track those. And Commission staff will read those on your behalf. As a reminder, each registered attendee is provided a unique link or phone number to access the webinar. These should not be shared with other participants, as this can create confusion for staff when making comments. Please do your best to be concise. Please make sure that your comments add new information. If you agree with the comments of a previous speaker, simply make that statement. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Justin. So we can proceed to the next slide, please. Next slide. So here with us today is Linda Pierce, the principal engineer from NCE. They are helping us prepare the full needs assessment that is due January 1st, 2025. So I'm going to just briefly cover the next slide, which is a really high level recap of what Senate Bill 1121 is. So next slide, please. Again, Senate Bill 1121 was signed into legislation in 2022, and it directs that the commission prepare a 10-year statewide transportation needs assessment. Our intent is to assess the costs to operate, maintain, and grow the statewide multimodal transportation system, consider the costs to address climate resiliency, and to compare costs against the available transportation revenue. So we're looking at what that gap is and sort of what the impact on our transportation revenues will be too with the growing adoption of zero emission vehicles. So that's really a really high level sort of consideration of what the intent of the full needs assessment will cover and was discussed in the interim report as well. With that, Linda, I'm going to turn over the next slides to you, and please feel free to move to the next slide, Justin.
Great, thank you, Francis. There was a local agency survey that was sent to all the MPOs and the RTPAs, and the information that we asked was, first of all, what is the status of your regional transportation plan, as well as what are your 10-year multimodal transportation needs, as well as what that projection of revenue would be over that same 10-year period. Now, the fun thing about a survey is you can go very simple and try to ask for some very general things, but considering this is a needs and a revenue survey, we understood that there was going to be a lot of detail that's going to be asked. The categories for the needs and the revenue were also kind of generalized. And we also knew full well that a lot of the agencies may not have named it the same category. And so knowing that, there's a lot of things that we're going through and we're having to review and revise, reaching out to the agencies for clarifications, as we go through that process. Next slide, please. So again, these are kind of the categories, the general categories that we're looking at on both the needs and the revenue side. And you can see the level of detail. And granted, again, not all the agencies categorize needs and revenue in the same way, but we can get kind of the general sense of rolling these up into a little bit more larger groups, so complete streets, passenger rail, looking at the federal revenue, local and state revenue type of categories. Next slide, please. So for the state highway, there is the 2023 State Highway System Management Plan. So the information for needs and investments is very clearly laid out in this plan, and we just went ahead and took the information for the various programs, for the various investments, and used that to kind of assess the state highway type of needs and revenue, or investments as they refer to them. Next slide. So obviously we still have work to do. We're still doing some refinements, and so obviously when we get to the complete needs report, we will be providing some information related to the analysis as part of the survey, and certainly from the various plans. We also went through and did a assessment of the impacts of revenue with the implementation of the zero emission vehicles, or the ZEVs. And so I'm just got a couple of slides I want to go through to show you what's happening with that effort. Next slide, please. There's been a number of Assembly bills, Senate bills that have been enacted back from the Nunez in 2006 up and through 2022, that kind of sets the tone for reducing carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas emissions. And the graph on the right kind of culminates a couple of different things. Certainly the targets from each of the assembly bills and the Senate bill, but also shows you that actual emissions is where California is on reducing the tons of carbon dioxide. Now, the really good thing that I want you to focus on is that first red dot up at 1990 emissions. It really shows that California is ahead of plan in reducing carbon dioxide. This is a great thing. However, I also want to point out that people have the largest impact on how emissions are happening in California, as we all know that. But the effort to get to the 40% below by 2030 and the 85% below 1990 levels by 2046 is going to take some effort for everybody to get there. Certainly, if we follow the actual emissions and progress downward, we're probably going to be able to hit those values. But again, it is so people dependent, and really is going to figure out how well California continues to meet these goals through this process. All right, next slide, please. So also, CARB, the California Air and Resource Board, went through back in 2022, had an Advanced Clean Cars 2, which kind of sets some levels for conversion, or actually the replacement of gas vehicles, new gas vehicles, with the purchase of ZEV vehicles. And really, it's kind of just trying to get the transition. Let's get rid of the gas engines, the diesel engines, and let's move to ZEVs for passenger cars, trucks, and SUVs. And it is all, so the Advanced Clean Cars obviously is all cars. There is also an effort in 2022 to take a look at moving to the medium and heavy duty trucks, and so this is getting into the larger vehicles. semis and delivery trucks and UPS and FedEx and all those. And also it's looking at reducing the number of vehicle miles traveled. So as I was saying, it's not just going to be the transition from gas to zero emission, but it's also going to be a reduction in vehicle miles traveled that kind of helps set those targets for reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. All right, next slide, please. So there's also the clean fleets. So that's really kind of what I was getting into in the May 2023 effort. And this now sets some goals for the conversion of the medium and the heavy duty sales to ZEVs. So we're looking at 100% of the new truck sales are wanting to be ZEVs by 2036. And the little graph just kind of shows there is a progression. So there are other targets to hit by the time that you get to these years that are shown here. So that, we have to be 10%, delivery trucks, buses with 2 axles. There's a 10% by 2025, 25% by 28, and then obviously through the end, we're at 100% of those vehicles are ZEVs by 2035. And so it kind of breaks that down for the work trucks as well as the larger vehicles. You can see kind of how that plan works. There's also the seaport and rail trucks wanting to be all ZEVs by 2035. And then finally, the 2023 Clean Fleets also sets out a phased-in approach, again, for the federal, state, and local agencies, which kind of brings in that challenge of being able to meet that graph that's down there at the bottom. All right, next slide, please. There is also a number of studies that were conducted that take a look at how to quantify the impacts of ZEVs. The first one that came out a little while ago last year, beginning of this year, was the Legislative Analyst Report, the LAO, and they're really looking at, what policies need to happen and what are the implications on funding and the transportation funding and programs with those adoptions for the climate policies. The Mineta Transportation Institute also went through and did a really rigorous analysis, again, looking at electric vehicle policies and what are the impacts on revenues over the up until 2040. And then there was also another effort, the preliminary needs assessment analysis that was done through the SB 1121 work, and kind of shows kind of in line with the other two, really assessing the impact of ZEVs on revenue. And there's a couple of little nuances for each one of them, and I won't go into the heavy details. It certainly will be discussed in the complete needs report, at least, but for this presentation, we're gonna go high level. All right, next slide, please, Justin. And so this is kind of this comparison of these 3 studies. And before you go from the left to the right, I want to make sure that everybody knows doing a direct comparison of any one of these approaches is not appropriate because they all make totally different assumptions. It is all about adoption of ZEVs. There is vehicle miles travel reduction. There's improved fuel economy. The years of which was covered was different. The rate of inflation is different. So even though, it's easy for us to go over onto that right side and say, yeah, looks like about 0.5 billion per year. But be careful when you do that because they're not the same. So the LAO side, again, is looking at taking 85% adoption of new vehicle sales are ZEVs by 2045, looking at needing to reduce the vehicle miles traveled to the VMT, as well as the gas-powered cars are also improving their fuel efficiency. Then they also looked at a slightly less aggressive, so 65% ZEVs by 2045, and only improved fuel efficiency. So that second scenario didn't include the reduction of vehicle miles traveled. And then you look at it, and it's about $0.44 billion per year reduction in revenue. The needs assessment that was done through the SB 1121. And do note it's still a preliminary. We're still kind of making some refinements as we go. pretty much took the Advanced Clean Cars 2 and fleet carb regulations, but also improved the fuel efficiency for the gas. And it shows about a 0.55 billion per year reduction in revenue over that 10-year period. The MTI, or the Mineta Transportation Institute, did a lot of different scenarios. There are 8 of them in total, where they varied the vehicle miles traveled, the rate of ZEV adoption, as well as the improvement in fuel efficiency. And it's a very, like I said, it's a very broad band of the impact in revenue. But on average, it's somewhere, or like, I should not say that on average, but up to about 0.53 billion per year reduction in revenue from those various studies. And again, they're very, very broad and very wide as far as the impact for revenue goes. All right, Francis, turn that back to you.
Thanks, Linda. Yeah. So again, I think based on the LAO report and MTI's report that it is published and out there, this just kind of highlights the structural problem with the gas tax, primarily, and sort of the challenge we're really facing now with how we fund transportation in California. While we meet our climate goals, there is also the question of like, how do we continue funding transportation in that aspect? So it is really great that we're meeting some of the targets, and as we work towards meeting our others. But I think it would be disingenuous not to kind of ask ourselves, what do we do? As we continue to improve our fuel economy, as people continue to adopt more zero emission vehicles, like we do have to address this big issue coming forth. So Justin, could you move to the next slide, please? So we're just gonna move right into the first principles discussion. And actually, we'll pause here. There are a few questions in the Q&A, and I think we can take a few of those questions before going straight into the first principles. So Justin, could you assist there?
Thank you, Francis. So we have a question from Rob Ball. The graph shows that we met the 2020 GHG reduction goals. ARB and CAPTI suggest we have not. Why is there a difference?
So I will say, I believe that graph that we shared in our presentation is straight from the legislative analysts office from their report. And so I believe it's just what the graph should be stating is we did meet, I think, the very first AB 32 target below 1990. That was about it. But Laura, would you like to?
Well, I think what might be good is, Rob, we can work on getting an answer back to you in writing. And I'm also noticing Anna Krieger from Greenlining eagerly leaning forward. Did you want to make a comment here in the room?
I'm just wondering if it's overall emissions compared to transportation specific.
Exactly. So I think we can verify that the number that is populating that graph, like the exact sectors of emissions that are going into it. And then Rob, we can close the loop with you. And then wanted to mention too, that in addition to recording this webinar, we'll also be posting the questions and answers. So that'll kind of help close the loop for others as well. But it's a good question, Rob. We appreciate it. And we will get you the official answer.
Okay. Justin, next slide, please. So we're just going to have a really big group discussion over the proposed first principles. I do want to state that these are by no means what is in the report, because we don't have a report out, but it's more of a starting point for discussion. So this is exactly as what was presented at the May 30th meeting. We did get some feedback at the meeting, and we'll be incorporating that as we work on our working draft, just to kind of get a more broad, full summary from both workshops to be reflected in our working draft report. But the first principles, by and large, are built on existing principles or strategies, goals that exist in the state. Specifically, I'm going to call out the Core 4 developed by the California State Transportation Agency. Many of our first principles also align with the California Transportation Plan 2050 goals too. And so really these are, you know, guiding principles on what sort of investments, the types of transportation projects we want to call out, and issues we want to bring forth at the end of the needs assessment when the report is developed. So generally, you know, our questions are, what are your initial thoughts? Does this capture what you feel is important in framing what transportation investments need to accomplish in the future? What might be missing? Do any more first principles need to be added? So, you know, we're going to take everything that we heard from both workshops and incorporate that in the working draft report that we anticipate releasing this summer. So I will open it up now to anyone with questions, and I don't know if anyone in the room has a question yet. If you do, just state your name so we can take your name down for our summary for later today. So Justin, I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Francis. So we do have a question from anonymous attendee. It is likely that virtually vehicles replaced with new ZEVs will continue to be operated until the end of their useful lives. If not in California, then elsewhere in the world. What effect does this have on the climate change brought on by ZEVs?
Give us a moment. We're processing the question.
So I'm going to admit I probably don't fully understand the question, but I'll take a stab at it just to make sure that I'm clarifying. So vehicles replaced with new ZEVs will continue to be operated until the end of their useful life, either in California or elsewhere. So I think the point of this question is that there's a climate impact associated with the continued operation of those internal combustion engine vehicles. And I imagine that this is something that is being considered and or measured. It's not something that I could speak to as a subject matter expert. I think perhaps what Francis and I could do is float the question. It seems like it might be a question for California Air Resources Board staff, perhaps. So yeah, if the attendee would like to clarify the question, if I didn't get that correct, I'd appreciate it. Otherwise, we're happy to pass it along and follow up with an answer after the webinar.
We have an attendee with a hand raised. Martha Armas Kelly.
Good afternoon. I'm very excited about these proposed first principles. I understand you have a lot of these models that were tailored off of some of the existing programs such as CAPTI and the like. But I do really wish that we would include an area that would contribute to tribal entities. I know that oftentimes we recognize that groups from DAC or areas of need, disadvantaged communities, are blighted, but in the area of tribal entities, they're sovereign entities, and they should be considered as contributors and should be recognized in the outline for first principles, as far as including those that are most marginalized. In the innovation and technology area, again, I'm going back to some of the things that I had discussed previously. I really feel that there should be an inclusion for right to fix. And that's something that we haven't considered. And then the other is like looking at some of this, the expenditures that we're going to be facing in the upcoming years as as a department all by itself, because we're looking at climate being the mitigating force behind some of these costs, and to just put it in one group and say it's going to be attended to or well represented is not fair. I think that we really need to step back and recognize that climate is a force to be reckoned with, and in its capacity, it's going to require its own funding stream. So that's just one or two thoughts that I want to throw out there.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm gonna let Hannah speak from Green Mining Institute.
Yeah, hey folks. Thank you so much. These principles look really solid. And I think what I'm kind of grappling with right now is that, you know, we have all of these existing principles, whether it's through the California Transportation Plan and those goals which reflect this. You know, we have CAPDI goals, but the challenge is there's no process in place to track and report how transportation investments and projects actually are delivering on these outcomes. So for example, again, these principles largely reflect what's in the California Transportation Plan. And then on the other hand, we have the Rebuilding California dashboard where those projects are listed, but that information is super limited. It's basically like, where's the project? How much does it cost? And then a really short description of the project. There's no detail around, is this project advancing equity? Is it delivering on safety? In which communities? And so it's challenging to understand, like, what do we need for the future? What are all of our needs when there's no way for the state to display how those investments are delivering on all of these really great outcomes? And so absolutely that will involve administrative costs, that will involve tracking data we've never tracked before, but particularly from a budget shortfall perspective, like there's never been a more critical time to understand the impact of every dollar. So I'd recommend that transportation or transparency and accountability be listed as a principle, and maybe it's something that's even integrated throughout, and then a specific recommendation on like what kinds of like systems and structures and administrative processes do we need to do this? Because I think until that is set, we're just going to keep having more principles that we then like can't deliver on concrete outcomes. But again, this list looks great, and I'll just add that accountability transparency piece.
Thank you for your comment, Hannah. All right, Doug, I'm gonna turn it back to you and Justin now.
Thank you. So we have a couple of follow-ups to the response, the answer to the first question from the anonymous attendee. So Jared Sanchez followed that up with, I like it. Just a question, how do these various ones received priority, or are they all equally weighed?
Currently, there is no priority or weight. They were just thrown up on the screen, again, as a starting point in discussion. And I think, for many of us, there are some of the principles here that, would rank on top more than others. But I think in general, we're trying to look at, what we need to address in this state. Laura, if you want to.
I can add a little to that. Like, I want to just, agree with Frances in her description of them as like co-equal goals. I think we're acknowledging that these are all things that are important, and they're all things that transportation funding should be helping to address. How I look at it, and I'm curious if anyone has different thoughts, is, as we talk about a sustainable funding solution that would replace the state excise tax, for example, I think we need to acknowledge that that is but one funding stream in a lot of others. And so I think by approaching this with this notion of like, these are first principles, these are co-equal goals. I think we're trying to hit as many of these as we can with the acknowledgement that as a project develops out all of its various funding sources that will be necessary to deliver it, you know, we're trying to just make sure that we're continuing to deliver projects that are, you know, holistically addressing as many of these as possible without putting one in a heavier weight category than another, which potentially could, you know, be divisive or not set us up to bring projects forward that could really like compete for or get funding from a number of different sources. So hopefully that makes sense. I think, and for this discussion, these are all important things. And we want decision makers to understand that unless we find a sustainable funding source, we lose out in all of these categories.
Taking another question in the room.
Yeah, hi, I'm Yesenia Perez from the Green Mining Institute. I guess to that question around prioritization of what moves forward and how priorities can be identified, I have another question just on how, you know, larger versus rural MPOs and knowing that they have competing needs and completely different needs, how those needs are being assessed statewide, and also understanding that, you know, some NPOs and communities will be early adopters of ZEVs and are feeling that impact sooner rather than others. So that, I think that was more of a question and a comment as well, just trying to understand how that's captured in the needs assessment.
I think from a little bit from the interim report, the recognition that the needs are slightly different and the challenges can be greater in one region, geographic region, than the other. And I think like that's how we have touched based on it at a broader level. I think in terms of funding, you know, one of the things as we were doing some of the research here, you know, a challenge for all, both like small, like rural and large MPOs or RTPAs, you know, one aspect is specifically in transit, like the adoption of zero emission buses and what the cost is. And so, you know, it's expensive for all the agencies, but I think like the magnitude of that, like to meet some of those climate goals is much higher or larger in the smaller agencies because they don't have as much of a funding option or stream available to them. And again, you know, we're really just talking about the state excise gas tax. So, you know, overall, how do we find a solution to try to stabilize it and bring it to a point where it's reliable? But, you know, a lot of our larger NPO partners have subsidized or supplemented that with additional, you know, local funding, other measures and things to try to help like get our transportation projects done and also meet like our climate goals as well. But you know, I know that's also a tenuous sort of situation as well. And so it's this really broad conversation of like what we like to highlight to the legislature again, like, you know, generally what we understand at a broad level, what our needs are, what the funding outlook's looking like, you know, and to really make the point like, you know, we are at a critical juncture and, you know, the decisions we make probably in the near term to address that should be done sooner rather than later. We will update the report in 5 years, but it'll be really interesting to see what happens, you know, between now and 5 years where we're at. I hope that answered part of your question. I know that's a very specific example. And again, you know, I think respecting like just how they're different sort of transportation like issues to address in the regions, I think being respectful like that, yes, not one size fits all, but we are working collectively together to try to meet these climate goals. And if we don't have any funding, it makes it much more challenging in that aspect. Doug.
Thank you. Some of the folks are typing your questions into the chat. We ask that you type them into the Q&A so we can capture them for the long term and not use the chat if at all possible. Thank you. We'll go to Mark Watts. You have your hand raised. You should be able to unmute and talk now.
There you go. Thank you. Hi, I've got a couple thoughts. As an original assistant in helping the chair's office develop this bill. I think we've gone a little bit broader than what we were hoping for, but I'm willing to travel along with you in this process. But a couple comments. First, if I were doing this, I would take maintaining and safety and multimodal mobility and have them as 1A. The rest would be 1B. That's just my thought. Secondarily, I'm thinking that anything related to tribal gets embedded in the state's processes right now in a very, very important and smart way that never existed before the last 4 or 5 years. So I'm not sure how to fold that into this when we're talking about protecting the system and making sure it's safe. But I'm open to hearing how that goes. I would also say that probably something that's missing here, but it's probably buried in accessibility, is senior and disabled persons funding. I know the thrust of this entire exercise is to do it within the existing available transportation program funding. But I think it's probably, that would be one area where we might bend the funding geofence and allow that in, because it's not working with you relying on Medicare. It's not relying on local self-help counties honing up a little bit of money in their particular area of jurisdiction. It's just not working as well as it should be. And I think it needs to be thought of differently and maybe its own principle. And I think that's all I'll go with right now. You know, one more thought. Going back to maintaining the system and infrastructure, particularly with respect to interstate systems, that's all aligned with the Eisenhower plan and what the FHWA has been administering for the last 40 years, 45, 50 years, I guess. I can't add very well. So we probably should be paying attention to the interstates as a little bit different than conventional state highways and local roads, because if we don't do a good enough job doing what we need to in the state, we're going to run afoul of what the feds are doing until they change their mind. So those are my comments, and hope I'm not disruptive. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Doug?
Thank you. And thanks to the folks who put their questions in chat who have since moved them over to Q&A. We'll go with Paul Hirling. We recommend adding a regional partnership principle. Local and regional tax measures are becoming more and more important in the state in funding state transportation goals and projects in an environment of declining state funding. Regional agencies have rising importance in promoting the transition to EVs and will be doing some heavy lifting promoting gas tax replacement funding mechanisms.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for your comment and suggestion. We noted, I think, regional partnerships from our May 30th meeting, and it was one that, we did open with our opening remarks when Paul spoke earlier today, the other Paul, not you. So I appreciate your comment for today as well. Doug?
Christine Williams, also thank you for moving your comment over to Q&A. I would also recommend adding integration both across transportation systems, as well as in thinking through how transportation investments integrate into existing planned land use patterns.
Thank you, Christine, for your comment and suggestion. We will note that for our working draft. And I think, Doug, similarly, there were a few comments above that I will say, some of the suggestions we see. Jeannie, I noted your suggestion of what to add, and we'll take note of affordable housing and reducing VMT. And Doug, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. We have a couple more comments from Anonymous. Given the urgency of the climate crisis, I would prefer to see proven solutions, catenary electric rail, prioritized over innovative solutions that may not be ready for prime time, i.e. hydrogen. Also, it appears that ZEVs, because of their batteries and exotic and rare materials needed to build them, will not be nearly as important a reducer of GHG as is often claimed. For this reason, the reduction in VMT could end up being much more important element affecting climate change than electric vehicles. Is there enough real effort being given to reducing VMT?
I appreciate both of these questions. And I think this is good information for, us as state agency staff working in the transportation space to be considering. I think it's a level of detail that is perhaps a bit more granular than the purpose of this needs assessment. So what I think we can do is we can add this to like the information that we share with California Air Resources Board staff. And, I think the ultimate goal when this assessment develops out and is shared with decision makers is for us not to become too prescriptive or specific in terms of things like the technology that's used, to replace any certain transportation mode. I think, but just to acknowledge, generally speaking, that the infrastructure is expensive and needed, and we lack stable revenue streams to be able to support it. So want to make sure that the anonymous attendee knows that we've taken note of this and we'll be sharing it, but it might not make it verbatim into, the document itself. But thank you for your participation.
Got a couple of questions from one of our new interagency EAC members, Michelle Rousey. On equity and accessibility, what definitions are defined within that? And seniors and persons with disabilities should be put on this at every level. We sometimes forget that when we make things accessible for one population like seniors and persons with disabilities, we make it accessible for all.
Thank you, Michelle. Very much appreciate your service on our Equity Advisory Committee and these thoughts that you're sharing today. In terms of the first question around the definitions for equity and accessibility, I think that's part of the discussion that we're having right now that you've been contributing to. So when we talk about accessibility, I think we can work into our first principles within the document and just how we describe the concept of accessibility as needing to ensure that elderly and disabled access, is a cornerstone of that. And so we can do our best to be very explicit in that area. And then on the topic of equity, I think that is another principle that has different layers and angles, so to speak. So I think there's obviously the equity associated with the funding stream itself, like the mechanism by which it's being collected. And I think that will be an important thing to dig in on when we look at potential policy recommendations. And as we're exploring something like, a statewide road charge that could replace the excise tax, that does have some equity connections because, for example, the way that gas tax is currently structured, it is regressive. And there are individuals who have the least amount of means driving some of the least fuel efficient vehicles. So they're paying, a larger share, so to speak, to use the system. So I think we would want to look at it, in that way. And then there's also just the larger concept of the overall system and the fact that having an equitable transportation system, it needs to be multimodal, it needs to be accessible, it needs to be the things that we're trying to better understand from the users and from the Equity Advisory Committee members. So we definitely want to make sure we hit those points in the first principles that we outline in the document. So we'll look forward to working with you and other advisory committee members to make sure that we're getting the language correct. But want you to know that we you know, we hear those two suggestions and we'll be working on them.
The next question is from the Interagency Equity Advisory Committee Vice Chair, Martha Armas Kelly. Framework is good, but how are we going to reach these principles without tangible outcomes? We should see the strategies or action items brought forth in this document in order to truly see the direction the state wants to take.
Hi, Martha. In part, I think with the development of the first principles, it is meant to be sent to the legislature to let them understand, again, what's important. And I agree with you that we need strategies and outcomes, but I think that will take another sort of effort, working, I think, more specifically with our regional partners, and probably when legislation's written for this in more detail. But I think, Laura, given your experience, maybe you can.
Well, yeah, I can add to that, Princess. So Martha, this is a very good point you raised, which is, you know, we're talking a lot, but what are we actually proposing to do? Fair question. So I think that we'll get at this a couple of different ways. So first and foremost, the purpose of this effort is to like identify the problem and then to be able to offer some potential policy solutions. So as we get through this workshop and staff takes what we've gotten and we go back, we're going to be trying to work on like what those policy recommendations are. And I see those as maybe some of the strategies that you're asking for more like detail and information on. So I want you to know that we are planning to work, you know, very closely with the stakeholders who are involved in this effort to make sure that you see those, you weigh in on them, and that, you know, this is not a surprise when we have a working draft, and that, you know, everyone has an opportunity to comment on those recommendations and those strategies. To Francis's point, you know, there's only so much that we can do in this assessment and in the recommendations. Then we get to transfer the responsibility to the legislature and to sort of the broader process of there being like the actual development of the policy itself. And there's some things that, you know, the legislature is going to want to like debate and figure out as part of, you know, an actual policy solution, like a bill or something that would get ready to implement any of these recommendations. So we will definitely make sure you all can see draft strategies. And then if I did not answer your question, let me know. We can always chat more offline.
Couple more questions from Anonymous. And this question was actually asked a couple different places in the chat and in the Q&A. Transportation has such a huge impact on land use, community, quality of life. I think that there should be stronger recognition of this. Equity and economic development are not specific enough. And to add to the first principles, consider resilience and adaptability. What I mean is transportation system that can adapt to changing conditions and recover quickly from disruptions, such as a natural disaster or economic shifts. Also, federal and local partnerships that can help with funds.
Your comment is noted, and I think that, well, yes, your comment's noted, sorry, I'm processing, on sort of the impact that transportation has, not just in moving people to and from places, but again, what you noted, livability, housing, all those aspects. And I think that in part ties in with sort of two frames of how accessibility has been viewed in transportation, not just accessibility for users, but access to places as defined in the CTP. So we will touch on that in the needs assessment on, you know, how transportation is integral to us in California and how it does affect us as well. Context.
Yeah, this is Hannah with Green Lining, and I definitely agree with that last comment. I think it's important for climate resilience to actually be pulled out and have it as its own principle. I think so often we think about environmental sustainability, reducing emissions, and there's kind of like this afterthought of climate resilience. But as we see with climate disasters almost every day now, I think we have to be thinking about it in a way that's very unique and specific. And even resilience has many different facets to it. There's obviously the infrastructure piece around ensuring that projects aren't in flood zones or fire zones, but there's also this community resilience component. It's about people being able to use the transportation system to weather the climate crisis. So being able to evacuate using transportation routes, about shade structures at transit stops. And so I think there's this uniquely human component to and community-centered approach to climate resilience. So I think that's why it's important to separate it out. But then also because I don't think there really is a process so far that the state has to analyze, how is this project, responding to climate resilience or adaptation? Like we're starting to, of course, track reduce emissions, but there's not really something uniquely specific. There's been certain programs, but obviously there's not funding for that anymore. So I think that kind of lends itself to why it needs to be a specific, unique component.
Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, and I know, climate, adaptation or climate, the climate crisis is not just an impact on transportation, it impacts us across the board in the community. So all infrastructure, whether that's housing, roads, buildings. So your point is well noted and taken there in that it's, broadly speaking, we know sort of one impact on how to address some very specific things within transportation, but sort of, taking the step back and stating like, how does this affect us on a day-to-day, connected to transportation?
I would just add that as a first principle, I think that kind of pulls double duty in my mind. It's like the notion of like having like a resilient type of a funding stream, right? To fund like a resilient transportation system, because the time that Francis and I have been talking a lot with the Caltrans, and they're really starting to better understand and wrap their brain around what it is costing just in the shop to deal with climate change. And so I think it's a talking point, a theme that I think resonates. So definitely appreciate that, and we'll work on adding that and making sure it's getting its due justice. And I forgot when I was answering Michelle Rousey's question, something I wanted to highlight really quick on the disabled and elderly accessibility. I did want to make sure that I shared that is it the Department of Aging, the DACLAC? Yeah. Oh man, okay, this is an acronym I'm not going to be able to get, but essentially there's an advisory committee that has been putting together essentially like recommendations around the types of like investments and funding that are needed to promote accessibility for disabled elderly individuals. And so we are going to be looking very closely at that and reflecting what we can in the assessment. So that'll get some due attention as well.
And I have a follow-up to Michelle's question. She said, thank you. I'd like to see progress and proposed goals set up that we can hit our long-term and short-term goals on these principles.
Thanks, Michelle. I think we can work on how we capture that in the vein of accessibility and transparency.
And I have a follow-up from Yvonne Garcia about the previous question about land use, community quality, quality of life. The same could be said about the other way around. Land use and housing impacts and other things impact transportation, even more so. Comment from EAC Chair William Walker. In regards to Francis's response, I think in addition to regional partners being consulted, that we find a way to ask transit users what the priorities should be for regional partners as well. The partners have a huge voice in this process, riding public does not. Having equity committees meet with legislators can also provide them perspective. Their thoughts are not always informed by the underrepresented groups.
Thanks, William. I think it is noted, well, thank you for bringing up the riding public and ensuring that they get the opportunity to provide input here as well. I think another good avenue, and I think many of you have heard me say this before, under CalSTA, the development of, or the CalSTA's Senate Bill 125 in addressing the reform of the Transit Development Act. I think that would be a really good avenue to talk about or to advocate, what the rider needs are there, especially since the report is due out, I believe, October 2025. I know that they have a subcommittee of their own too, but I think that that is a good avenue to discuss specifically what needs to be addressed and what the concerns are, not just from an agency standpoint, but I think from the user standpoint in that vein.
So Laura, EAC member Rousey has a follow-up. Disability and Aging Community Living Committee, DACLAC. And she is the chair of the Transit Subcommittee.
Thank you, Michelle. I think, Adam, you had a question I saw.
Yeah, it's not so much of a question, but just a suggestion. Expand the multimodal mobility principle to add connectivity, because I think a lot of times we think about mobility as having these different options. I think I'm getting some feedback.
If you just set it there, it actually varies pretty far.
So I think it's just expanded to have connectivity, so there's more connections between modes. A lot of times trips include both walking and biking and transit, driving, so it's not just,
I see that as dovetailing on like what Christine Williams said around like system integration. Yeah.
That is all the questions I show at the moment.
All right. Well, I think we can take our 10-minute break now and we'll resume at, okay, I can tell time, 1:50. So grab water, stretch, and we'll be back on at 1:50 to start part 2 of our discussion.
Oh, thank you.
Next slide, please, Justin. So the second part of the workshop today is to talk about potential scenarios to address the gas tax decline, essentially. And so these are just scenarios, again, similar to what we had with our first principles as talking points, starting points. Based on the Legislative Analyst's Office's LEO and MTI's reports, with our declining revenue, these are just, again, scenarios we put out here to discuss. The first one is, what if you do nothing and continue as is? And I think we all know that that is going to continue downward. We just don't know how fast and how steep that trajectory would be, but I don't think we want to do that one. Scenario two, increase the existing mechanisms. And what that means is, what if we increase the gas tax again and increase the electric vehicle fees to kind of keep pace with, the state of good repair? Scenario three is phased in approach for road charge. So what that means is, what if we did just a road charge on electric vehicles for the time being before we get into, charging every user that drives, essentially. And then scenario four is a fully implemented road charge, meaning, if there was legislation passed, everyone would be paying the road charge rate at the same time. It would not be a phased-in approach. So there are different sort of things to consider. There are pros and cons, obviously, lots of questions of how that would be rolled out. And so essentially, are there other scenarios that are missing or that need to be considered, and what would need to be considered within those scenarios? So I'm going to open it up for everyone. It's very straightforward. I don't have the full solution. Yeah, so happy to take questions now or comments.
Hi, Hannah with Green Lining. Obviously I know that there's much more detail that goes into this, but for the phased in approach, I think it would make sense to start with electric vehicles, but with the caveat that their registration fee should then be, that should be the replacement for that, so they're not paying additional. And then also with the caveat that there should be some kind of equity design built in, both to how folks are charged to use the roads, and then on how those revenues are distributed. So we're not just spending money in the same ways that we always have, but are being responsive to the principles that you've shared, so that we are thinking about equity, climate resilience, all these other factors as well.
Thank you, Hannah. Doug, are there any questions?
Yes, so Michelle Rousey has her hand up online. Nope, did you put it back down? Nope, there she is. Michelle, you should.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think we need to get creative. I know if we do nothing, things are gonna get worse and decline. And increasing the existing mechanism, is that realistic to getting us where we need to be in 10, 20 years? And implementing a road tax for just those vehicles who've already put out money for having a low emissions vehicle, I think is not in the right way to go either. Although I do like scenario 4, are there other areas that we need to look at that we're not looking at now to look for revenue? And that's my question. Is there something has to be out there that we're not actually looking at and tapping into? Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. I think we're both pondering, I think with the Senate Bill 1121,
our effort has focused on what to do with the state excise gas tax. And so we have seen other revenue, you know, that I think a lot of our local partners have gotten, and on the federal side, I think we're really focused on addressing the state's revenue here on what to do with that aspect. But Laura, do you have, I see you're thinking about it too.
I would support what you just said, Francis. And I think, Michelle, we are in a position where we're needing to do what the legislature asked with this assessment. And I think we want the policy recommendations to be able to address like funding mechanisms that essentially would allow us to keep a lot of the structures that we have in place for how transportation funds are largely like administered, right? Like, I don't think that we would want to necessarily like, you know, do away with the entire system, but how do we work within like the framework that we have for how we collect transportation funding and identify like a mechanism that is more sustainable? So I don't in any way want to stymie creativity and like how we look at this, but you know, I do feel like regional transportation planning agencies have been trying very hard to figure out different revenue streams for transportation projects. And you know, I think we are tapped out in certain ways when it comes to taxes and fees, which is why we're trying to focus on a replacement for like the excise tax. But I think we would definitely want to, you know, ponder whatever we could. I think we want to just be careful not to make any recommendations that would require like a wholesale revisitation of, you know, how transportation funding is administered.
Adam.
Adam Nolting from MSC. I guess I'm just curious with some of these, right, increasing existing mechanisms, sounds great in theory and support looking at all of those, but obviously there's a lot of different options that kind of fall under that. Are you trying to come up with more discrete ideas, or are there going to be like variations within scenario 2 or scenario 3 as this kind of moves along?
Again, these are just sort of talking, you know, just to get us discussing like what could we do to replace the gas tax. So this just kind of is a frame of like the conversation, but as what you said, and also like Michelle, like, is it realistic to try to increase the gas tax? Like, you know, we could, but how big of a lift would that be, right? Like, it requires a 2/3 vote, like all these things that make it really challenging. And I think kind of explore, you know, also just engaging with everyone to kind of discuss like, you know, what that lift would take potentially. And is it worth doing this? Is it, you know, better to just go, and adopt something else entirely different to replace the gas tax, right? Because I think we want to explore and show that like, you know, what these challenges are. I mean, they're all of them pose different challenges in a different way, but like, it's not sustainable. Like,
Yeah, I guess just to add on, partially just thinking about like increasing existing mechanisms, like, you know, registration fees could be doubled or tripled, and you can get rid of the gas tax entirely, right? Simplify to one mechanism versus multiple mechanisms, right? I think we hear a lot about from folks that there's so many ways people are getting taxed for transportation infrastructure, whether it's sales tax, parking fees, potential tolls, bus fares, right? There's so many things that it just seems like it's just nonstop. So like maybe there's a way to consolidate it, just increase cost, like and that might not go over so well, but it's certainly something that's, I think, worth exploring to simplify in some regard. That may end up being a very similar and neutral aspect in terms of how much revenue, but it might be, rather than having all these different things, just one main revenue source. If there's a way to do it equitably.
Christina Gallagher Gallagher, CSAC, California State Association of Counties. I was just wondering, because I missed the Southern California, sorry. There was a Southern California meeting, correct? Did anything come out of there that, was there anything that was more favored at that meeting? I'm sorry I missed it too, but just wondering what we expect out of there. I apologize if this was discussed already.
We talked about it, and I think there was, support generally, for road charge to replace the state excise gas tax. We discussed the challenges of increasing the existing mechanisms. There was, a good suggestion to just, highlight that, replacing the gas tax, that would also, that means you're not paying at the pump, the state excise gas tax. So that would lower the cost per gallon, but that fluctuates over time. So it's kind of hard to pinpoint, exactly how much less you're paying until that's fully taken away. But more to highlight, we're not trying to double tax you in that capacity. I think in Paul's opening remarks earlier, we hit on some of those high level topics that we talked about, and this will be reflected in the summary. I still need to post the notes from the last one, but we are also going to highlight what was discussed here in our working draft and our full needs assessment, what was explored.
Thank you.
And then, Hannah, and then we'll go online.
I totally get the instinct around can we simplify this? This is complicated. I do not envy the job of someone trying to figure out how to administer this road user charge. But I do think the reality is this, it's such a complicated topic. It kind of requires a very complicated, nuanced approach. And I worry if we were to, let's just say, for example, double or triple registration costs, how is that fair for folks who have wildly different driving patterns? So for example, I just got a car for the first time 2 years ago. I probably drive I don't even know, 3,000 miles a year, just to the grocery store and back. Why should I have to pay 3 times registration costs versus someone who, is a super commuter? And I think at least with an approach that is road user charge, where you're paying based on how much you use the service, we do that for public transit, right? When I take BART, the farther I go, the more I pay versus, someone else who doesn't benefit from that system. And so I think there's ways that we can then also begin to shift behavior around folks who maybe never thought about how much they drive and, can they carpool with someone else, et cetera. So I understand that this is complicated, and at the same time, I think this is what's required in order to get us to those outcomes, to those principles that you've listed earlier. So I didn't reiterate it earlier, but I think absolutely road user charge is the way we need to go. I think we need to be really cautious and careful about how we go about it to make sure it's equitable and fair. But I do think it's the right approach, and I think it makes sense to phase it in, given that we at least have electric vehicles as a potential target for the first iteration.
Thanks, Hannah. Doug?
Thank you. So yes, our Interagency Equity Advisory Committee Chair, William Walker, has a number of comments. I'm going to hit on a few of them here. In response to Christine Williams' comment, developing a load factor that is too low for fixed route service could allow for lower productivity lines to be covered by on-demand service. Coupling on-demand service with traditional paratransit devices could expand the utility of a service that often misses calls because they don't have enough drivers to serve actual paratransit demands. Chair Walker also suggests a scenario 5 in this setting, a scenario that fully funds transit in areas where transit currently operates at 15-minute headways or less. He also suggests a scenario 6, a system that prices roads to fully fund transit. And some of the comments that came up at the last workshop that we did, how can agencies with fewer resources be provided technical assistance to ensure their assessment fully captures needs? How will SB 1121 also encourage sustainable transportation funding over less sustainable funding, i.e. highway expansion versus transit operations and capital expansion funding? And how do we ensure that the replacement for the gas tax does not limit itself to a one-for-one replacement, considering existing gas tax revenues do not cover the cost of the entire transit and road maintenance expense and need.
I'm trying to find the questions and I'm having a hard time but in terms of the investment and prioritization, I think that discussion in detail will probably come at a point when the state reviews our assessment and I think takes action. I think that's probably much more above, I think, the specificity that we're doing in this assessment. However, in terms of funding, well, yeah, I don't have the questions in front of me, so I really apologize. I was trying to like digest it that way and be able to answer them one by one.
Yeah. So, William, I believe we can offer this, which is that we'll be capturing each of the individual questions. And I especially want to thank you for putting so much detail into them and for, just putting down all the different ideas that you have. I think it will be good for us to take some time and process everything that we've heard today. And I also want to make sure you know that when it comes to like, especially some of the specific comments you have around transit and transit efficiency, like I think that's something that we can certainly pass along to the CalSTA staff that are working on the Senate Bill 125 work in the Transit Transformation Task Force. I think in general, what I will address in your questions that I think is really germane to like this effort is just sort of the notion that like if we were to even replace the gas tax in kind right now, that might not cover all our needs. So I think that is a really important point. And I did just want to like just emphasize that is something that the legislature and decision makers will really have to, I think, wrestle with, is this idea that like we have a substantial need and, we can replace part of that. But if we were to, explore a solution that got us more closely to like meeting our needs, that's going to look different in terms of what it costs to use the system. And another point I wanted to make, and I think it was around, what Hannah and Adam were talking about is just this notion that we've always traditionally funded transportation with a user pays approach, right? And I think as we, evolve as a society around like what use of the transportation system looks like, it's probably really important that we're looking at our funding source as well in that same regard. Definitely want to note that there's different ways, for that funding mechanism to be collected. I just look at it as like chart C that like lists all of the different transportation funding sources. And I would say like more importantly, where all those funding sources end up going, I think is a good indicator of how many different government entities would need to agree on like where the money would go. And I think if we could maybe, as part of this effort, acknowledge that we want to like continue with this notion of user pays, but be willing to, acknowledge that there are other streams, there are other things, and that we should be very cognizant of how much we are charging people, for their different uses, right? Whether that's parking or whether that's driving on a managed facility. I think it'll be important to be able to convey that like, yes, this is complicated and yes, folks feel like they are already paying a lot to use the system. But when it comes down to making this more sustainable, like what are some of the options that we could recommend and kind of try and like identify what some of the best potential solutions are that the legislature could start talking about. So I think it's just like, that was a very long-winded way of saying like, everything makes sense that folks are suggesting today. And as we digest it and sort of synthesize it into these like potential recommendations, I appreciate that we all come at this with a spirit of trying to just like reach a consensus, figure out, what can be in this assessment and can be recommended that, you know, represents an attempt to like meet these first principles and to help start a healthy debate in the legislature.
Quick follow-up from Chair Walker. It's not often that we have a chance to revolutionize funding transit. Not often we can change a tax system. It's a great opportunity to really think outside the box and determine the least regressive way to increase funding for a more sustainable transportation system. Got some additional questions. Alvy Dobson, road charge makes sense. Are the weight of the vehicles considered? EVs are significantly heavier than passenger cars with internal combustion engines. Because of the batteries, pickup trucks can be heavy too. Asking because heavier vehicles cause more fatal and severe injuries and more damage to the pavement.
Hi, Albie. So I would state that right now, Caltrans is doing their road charge pilot program, and also the commission leads the road charge technical advisory committee. So these are topics that have been explored, I think, quite a bit at the state. And there is recognition that, you know, trucks, you know, are heavier and do cause more damage to our roadways and state highway system. And with batteries, that would increase. And there are studies right now, yeah, discussing that. In terms of a fee, I think we are right now looking at, I think we have a good idea of what the light duty vehicle, meaning passenger vehicles, rate could potentially be. That's going to be carried out in the pilot program. So that will be really interesting to follow up and see how that wraps up once that's done. Right now, I know there is a national effort studying, you know, what the fees should be for trucks. There's several different coalitions that are undertaking these studies. We've had presentations from the Eastern Transportation Trucking Association. I don't recall off the top of my head exactly, but they are based on the East Coast and have been doing pilot studies of what that would look like in terms of interstate commerce there. So there would be, well, just to say, there is recognition that the fee structures would be different from light duty to medium to heavy duty vehicles. And I think as that technology comes on board and what that weight looks like, I think those are more specific considerations, I think, that will be delved in through academic research, and also I think through working with Caltrans, trucking associations, and through our road charge TAC probably. So I don't have the specific answer, but there's definitely recognition that they impact our roadways more. If they're batteries, it's going to be more impacted, and there is a different fee structure that will be analyzed for those vehicle weight classes.
Okay, I've got a three-parter from Rob Ball. I believe Rob is with Kerncock. Scenario 5, hybrid approach of scenarios 2 and 3.
Thank you, Rob.
He also has a comment. Scenario 3, 80% of wear and tear on major routes is from heavy duty trucks. Implement a road charge for trucks, but encourage less wear and tear by charging by the tire or axle weight. This would create incentive for reducing tire loads and wear on our roadways. Would also create an incentive and incentivize to ship more by rail. Start with a trucking road charge pilot. Encourage trucking to add axles or tires to reduce per weight, reducing wear and tear, potential for huge savings in road maintenance cost.
Thanks, Rob. Are there any other questions that you see or hands?
I've got one more in the chat from Zach Deutsch, Gross. Support the road user charge interested in a phased-in approach that leads into full implementation. Needs to advance equity in outcomes and process, including ensuring high adoption rates for low-income discount programs. That's all the questions I see.
Any additional questions or comments in the room?
Thank you. I have a question. This is Andrea Wynn with the Greenlining Institute. I'm not fully sure if this falls under the scope of SB 1125, so I'm just curious about your thoughts on this as well too. but what are the situations for making it cost less to maintain our roads as well too? Because right now we really bloat that process. And it's just it's really expensive to get our roads out, to get them maintained as well too. The longer that we stretch out those timelines, the more it impacts a lot of our like minority and women-owned contractors as well too. And that seems to be a situation where perhaps by cutting down those costs as well too, then maybe these scenarios can also become more manageable as well too. So curious how that factors in. Thanks.
So to reiterate, you're asking how we can keep costs down on our roadway projects, correct? Ooh, I wish I could control inflation. There are certain things there. I think that's one of the challenges. I think when we have project delays too, I think anytime there are delays overall, for whatever the reason, that ends up being a cost increase. I think if funding falls through too, sometimes that's a big issue where if there's not enough funding, we have to push out and delay. And that can lead not just roadway projects, but also I think like rail projects that come online. It's just really hard because I think in the industry, we don't have control over like the cost of materials and labor on that front. That is one of the reasons, but I don't know, Laura. if you have
I
any-
have a suggestion that I think might get at what you're like asking and possibly like wanting to see this process take into account. So back when Senate Bill 1 was being like developed and negotiated to raise the gas tax, one of the big parts of that discussion was the need to demonstrate efficiency. And so I'm wondering if maybe we might want to weave this notion of efficiency into like first principles, because I think it kind of falls into like efficiency, accountability, transparency, like being a good steward of taxpayer dollars. Because I do think that there are sort of two parts to this, right? Like there's the costs that really are difficult to control when it comes to delivering infrastructure, but it's also this notion that the longer we wait to bring our system into a state of good repair, the more expensive it is, right? So I think that will be some good messaging to add into this, and I appreciate you bringing that up because I don't know that we've really noted that yet in our workshop process, so we can weave that in.
And I was gonna say, as I was kind of thinking about, reporting out and like you said, accountability. I know there's accountability mechanisms that were put in place in Senate Bill 1, and I would presume that, that will be a big discussion, whatever's done in the future as well. But yeah, efficiency was.
We just got one more comment online. Albie Dobson. I understand most of the current managed lane revenues go to MPOs or local agencies. Would it be possible to create some managed lanes where the revenue goes to the state? The charge would have to be carried out equitably.
We can touch base with Caltrans there. I think that's something, I think within managed lanes, because that's within the jurisdiction of the MPOs, within their boundaries and within the districts, that's, I think, something that's negotiated there. But I know Caltrans was working on.
Yeah, I think what we can do, Albie, is we can take this suggestion and that sort of like thought process to the folks who at Caltrans are working on kind of like a statewide policy around managed lanes. And, Francis and I don't work like in that realm a lot. So, there's probably a lot of political context that we are unaware of. So we are going to, we'll make some inquiries with folks and, note it as something that's been suggested here. And, to the degree that that could, be mentioned or addressed, or even if it's just us being able to circle back with you as to like what some of the limitations are on that, like we can close the loop.
Okay, well, we can go to the next slide. So this is just a high-level overview of what we've done and where we're going. So we're now in summer. And, this is the second policy recommendation workshop where we wanted to get feedback from our stakeholders and the public. We will be working to release a working draft in August and provide that update at the August CTC Commission meeting. And we're going to kind of kick back or hold our stakeholder work group meetings again once we refine and get the data, I would say cleaned up, more refined in our analysis to really bring back, and provide a picture of what the needs are compared to our revenues and what that's looking like. So that's what's coming up in the summer. Once we put our working draft out for comment, we will take what we get back from everyone and bring that out to our fall CTC meeting. So a more polished draft will be released for October, and then it will be adopted by our commission or presented at our commission in December, and then submitted to the legislature January 1st. So it's a pretty straightforward sort of timeline, but we really are taking the input we've gotten from today, from some of our technical workshop, from what we heard, in the interim report. And so that's really crafting our working draft. And so it's not going to be polished at all, but I think, another really good chance to get input from our stakeholders there. And then Justin, next slide. I think it's just our contact information. So we really appreciate everyone coming out today to providing your input. If you have any additional questions or comments, please feel free to email me, Laura, or even Linda at NCE. And we will send you email updates as to what's going on once we kind of gear up for our working draft and solicit feedback. Most likely we'll hold like one more sort of meeting focused just on the working draft as well. So that's all. Thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you.